It was December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor had forever changed the course of American history. But while politicians and generals debated war strategies in Washington, D.C., across the country, in the small towns of California, Oregon, and Washington, thousands of Japanese-American families slept peacefully in their homes, unaware that their lives would be completely transformed in the coming months. Kimiko Tanaka was 34 years old and had 3 young children when the knock came on her door that May morning in Maitise, 1942. She was preparing breakfast when the government officials arrived with their clipboards and official seals. "You have 1 week to pack your things," they said. "Only what you can carry." Kimiko looked at her children, ages 6, 8, and 10, and for the first time in her life as a mother, she didn't know what to say. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the forced removal of more than 120,000 people of Japanese descent from the West Coast. 2/3 of these individuals were American citizens born in the United States. Among them were thousands of mothers who, like Kimiko, found themselves facing an unimaginable reality, leaving behind their entire lives to live in barbed wire fenced camps in the middle of the desert. But this isn't just a story about injustice. It's a story about how the human spirit finds light in the darkest places. It's about how extraordinary mothers transformed military barracks into homes, transformed isolation into community, and transformed despair into hope. It's about how some of these courageous women came to call those years in the concentration camps a blessing in disguise. And why? Let's begin our journey in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles. In early 1942, the streets that once echoed with the sound of children playing and street vendors hawking their wares now hummed with nervous conversations between neighbors. Rumors swirled like leaves in the wind. Some spoke of desert camps. Others spoke of mass deportation. Japanese-American mothers gathered in small groups, exchanging fragmented information and trying to decipher what was really happening. Sachiko Yamamoto, a mother of 4, remembers seeing posters plastered on the streetlights on her street. "The instructions for people of Japanese descent," the title read. She couldn't sleep that night. How would she explain to her children that they would have to leave the only home they'd ever known? How would she pack 17 years of family memories into 2 suitcases per person? The evacuation process began in the spring of 1942. Entire families gathered in temporary assembly centers, most often horse racetracks and fairgrounds, quickly converted into human quarters. The smell of hay mixed with disinfectant hung in the air. Children cried, confused by the sudden change. Elderly people sat silently, their faces bearing the weight of decades of hard work that now seemed meaningless. For mothers, this transition period was perhaps the most difficult. They weren't just responsible for their own emotions, they had to be strong for the whole family. Michiko Sato remembers comforting her 5-year-old daughter, who was crying because she couldn't take her favorite doll. "There's no room in the suitcase," Michiko explained gently, saving her own tears for later when everyone was asleep. But it was in the permanent camps that the real transformation began. Places like Manzanar, California, Minidoka, Idaho, and Rower, Arkansas, became the new homes for these families. Surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire, these camps housed between 8,000 and 18,000 people each. Mothers arrived to find wooden barracks divided into apartments, single rooms where entire families lived, separated only by hanging curtains. The first challenge was to make those spaces habitable. Yuki Nakamura remembers arriving at the Topaz camp in Utah on a particularly windy day. Desert sand seeped into every crack in the poorly constructed walls. "My first reaction was to sit on the ground and cry," she recalls. "But then I looked at my 3 children, covered in dust, looking at me as if I had all the answers. And I realized I had no time to despair." It was at this moment that something extraordinary began to happen. These mothers, stripped of their homes, their communities, and their dignity, began to create something new. They took scraps of fabric and made colorful curtains. They collected rocks from the desert to create small gardens in front of their huts. They organized sewing groups where they exchanged stories and advice on how to make life in the countryside more bearable for their children. Chio Okazaki, who had 7 children when she was sent to Manzanar, developed what she called rituals of normalcy. Every morning, she would wake before sunrise to fix her hair and put on one of her 2 clean blouses. "If I didn't take care of myself," she explained years later, "how could I take care of my family? How could I set an example for my children that we were still a decent family even under those circumstances?" The daily routine in the camps was rigorously structured. Breakfast was served in the communal dining halls at 6:30 in the morning. Mothers rose even earlier to get their children ready and walk through the dusty corridors to the large rooms where hundreds of people ate their meals in silence. For many of these women, accustomed to preparing elaborate home-cooked meals for their families, eating institutional food from metal trays was one of the most difficult adjustments. But even this experience became an opportunity for connection. Mothers began sitting together, forming informal groups where they discussed the challenges of raising children in the countryside. They shared strategies for maintaining discipline when there was no privacy, how to explain to their children why they were there, and how to keep alive the hope that one day they would return home. Hanako Fujimoto had a unique approach to coping. She turned every hardship into a lesson for her children. When the water in the communal shower was cold, she would say, "This teaches us to be grateful for hot water when we have it again." When the desert wind covered everything with sand, she observed, "We're learning how desert plants survive. They adapt and grow stronger." The education system in the camps became a particular source of concern and, paradoxically, pride for mothers. Schools were established quickly, but resources were limited. Qualified teachers were scarce. Textbooks were outdated and classrooms were often overcrowded. For mothers who deeply valued their children's education, this situation was almost unbearable. It was then that many of these remarkable women took matters into their own hands. Those with college degrees volunteered as teaching assistants. Others organized after-school study groups. Mothers skilled in traditional Japanese art began teaching origami, calligraphy, and flower arranging to rural children. Bridging their cultural heritage with their American identity, Mary Kageyama, who had been a teacher before the war, established what she called an after-school in her barracks. Every afternoon after dinner, children from all over the camp gathered for extra lessons in math, reading, and writing. "I knew our situation was temporary," she explained decades later, "but the lost education is permanent. I couldn't allow that to happen to our children." The most surprising aspect of life in the camps was how these communities began to flourish culturally. After overcoming the initial shock and establishing basic survival routines, the mothers began organizing activities that enriched everyone's lives. They formed theater groups that performed plays in both English and Japanese. They organized seasonal festivals that kept Japanese traditions alive while incorporating elements of American culture. The Obon Festival, a traditional Japanese celebration honoring ancestors, was particularly significant in the camps. Mothers worked for weeks preparing decorations made from recycled and improvised materials. They taught traditional dances to children who had never learned them before. These celebrations became moments of community unity so powerful that even camp guards often stopped to watch, moved by the beauty and dignity of the preserved traditions. Toshi Yamamoto remembers organizing the first Obon festival in Minidoka. "We didn't have traditional paper lanterns, so we made them with decorated flour sacks. We didn't have recorded music, so we sang the traditional songs a cappella. It was the most beautiful Obon festival of my life, because we realized that tradition isn't in the objects. It's in our hearts and our determination to preserve it." As the months turned into years, something unexpected began to emerge in the mothers' conversations. They began to notice positive changes in their family lives that hadn't existed before the war. Without the pressures of outside work, many fathers spent more time with their children. Without the distractions of urban life, families communicated more deeply. Without the socio-economic segregation of their home communities, children from different backgrounds mixed freely. Rose Tanaka noted that her teenage daughter, who was shy and withdrawn before the war, flourished in the communal environment of the camp. In the camp, she couldn't hide in her room. She had to learn to socialize, to contribute to the community, to take responsibility. When we left, she was a completely different person, more confident, more mature, more aware of her role in society. These observations led to deep discussions among the mothers about the meaning of their experiences. In informal support groups that naturally formed, They began to articulate something that initially seemed almost heretical, the idea that, despite all the injustice and suffering, there were aspects of their experience in the field that were genuinely beneficial. This perspective didn't arise from passive acceptance or Stockholm syndrome. It arose from these women's determination to find meaning and purpose even in the most adverse circumstances. They refused to see themselves merely as victims. Instead, they chose to see themselves as survivors who could draw valuable lessons from their experiences. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, who spent 3 years at Manzanar, developed a philosophy she shared with other mothers. We can choose to be destroyed by this experience, or we can choose to be strengthened by it. If we choose to be strengthened, we have a responsibility to ensure our children see our strength, not our bitterness. The lessons these mothers taught about resilience extended far beyond the confines of the field. They observed that their children developed exceptional adaptive skills. They learned to value relationships over material possessions. They developed an early understanding of social justice and human rights that prepared them to become more conscientious and engaged citizens. Many children who grew up in the camps became civil rights advocates, dedicated educators, and community leaders. Their mothers often attributed this social consciousness to the lessons learned during their years of internment. My children learned firsthand what it means when democracy fails, Lily Nakai observed. They never took their freedoms for granted because they knew what it was like to live without them. Education within the camps also took on unexpected dimensions. Qualified teachers among the inmates began offering courses that went far beyond the core curriculum. Classes in philosophy, literature, art, and music flourished. Some mothers reported that their children received a richer and more diverse education in the camp than they would have received in their home schools. Dr. Satsuki Ina, who was born in a concentration camp, later observed, "My mother always said that the camp was where she learned that true education doesn't come from beautiful buildings or expensive equipment. It comes from a passion for teaching and a determination to learn." The teachers in the camp taught with an intensity and dedication she had never seen before. The medical aspects of camp life also revealed surprising dimensions of the maternal experience. Initially, health conditions were precarious. Lack of adequate medication, overcrowding, and emotional stress created significant challenges. But mothers organized themselves to create care networks that compensated for many of these deficiencies. Traditional Japanese midwives worked alongside Western doctors to ensure safe births. Herbal medicine experts shared knowledge of medicinal plants that could be cultivated even in the arid countryside. Emotional support groups naturally formed, offering informal counseling to those struggling with depression or anxiety. Dr. James Yamazaki, who worked as a physician at Manzanar, recalled years later, "The Japanese mothers transformed our rudimentary hospital into something special. They brought wildflowers to decorate the rooms. They cooked special soups for the patients. They organized visiting shifts so no one was alone. They humanized medicine in a way I had never seen before." Births in the camp carried special meanings. These children were natural-born Americans, born on American soil, but in circumstances that questioned the true meaning of national belonging. The mothers of these children often expressed a complex mix of joy at their new life and sadness at the circumstances of their birth. But many also found symbolic hope in these births. "When my daughter was born in Topaz," Kyoko Nishiura recalled, "I held her and thought, this child represents the future. She was born an American, and no one can take that away from her. She will grow up in a better country than the one that brought us here." Intergenerational relationships in the camps also took on unique dynamics. Grandparents who had immigrated from Japan found themselves living in unprecedented proximity to their Americanized grandchildren. Initially, this created tensions. The older generations were more willing to accept government authority and maintain a low profile, while the younger Japanese Americans felt anger and wanted to resist. Mothers found themselves in the middle of these tensions, serving as translators not only linguistically, but also culturally and emotionally. They mediated discussions between grandparents, who spoke primarily Japanese, and children who communicated primarily in English. They explained to the elderly why the young were angry, and explained to the young why the elderly preached patience. This constant mediation developed remarkable diplomatic skills among these women. Many discovered leadership talents they didn't know they possessed. They organized community councils, mediated disputes between neighbors, and represented their families' needs to the camp administration. Ruth Osawa, who would become a renowned sculptor, always credited her mother with teaching her these leadership skills during her years in the field. "My mother showed me that leadership isn't about having formal authority," she noted. "It's about taking responsibility for the well-being of your community, especially when, no one asked you to do so." Economic activities within the camps also revealed surprising aspects of maternal creativity and determination. Although inmates received a small amount of money for essential work, many mothers developed informal businesses to improve their families' living conditions. They set up sewing businesses, repairing and altering clothing for other inmates. They developed cooperative childcare services. Some established small shops, selling crafts made from recycled materials. Others offered private English lessons to older inmates or Japanese classes to children who were losing touch with their cultural heritage. These endeavors weren't motivated solely by financial necessity. They represented a refusal to passively accept the limitations imposed by confinement. The mothers were demonstrating to themselves and their children that there were always ways to exert some measure of control over their circumstances. But perhaps the most profound aspect of maternal transformation in the camps was spiritual. Many of these women found or rediscovered an inner strength they didn't know they possessed. They developed a faith, not necessarily religious, but existential, in the human capacity to transcend adverse circumstances through love, determination, and community. Agnes Yamada described this transformation. "Before the war, I worried about small things, whether the house was clean enough, whether the food was perfectly prepared, whether my clothes were fashionable. In the camp, I learned to distinguish between what is important and what is trivial. Family is important, health is important, education is important, dignity is important. The rest is just decoration." This clarity of priorities had lasting effects on the way these mothers raised their children after the war. They emphasized values over possessions, character over appearances, and perseverance over ease. Many of their children became exceptionally successful individuals, not only in material terms, but also in terms of significant contributions to their communities. The support networks that formed among mothers in the camps also endured well beyond the years of internment. When families were finally released, many found their homes vandalized, their property stolen, and their communities hostile to their return. But they had something they hadn't had before the war: a national network of women who had been through the same experience and understood their unique challenges. These networks became vital support systems during the difficult years of post-war reintegration. Mothers in different parts of the country exchanged information about job opportunities, friendly schools, and welcoming communities. They organized annual reunions where children who had grown up in different camps could reconnect. They created scholarships for higher education and emergency funds for struggling families. Decades later, when the civil rights and reparative justice movements began, it was often these mothers and their networks who provided the necessary organizational leadership. They had learned to transform personal trauma into collective action, to channel anger into constructive advocacy, and to use their own experiences to educate others about the dangers of prejudice and mass hysteria. The movement for reparations for Japanese American internees, which culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, was largely led by women who had been mothers in the camps. They testified before Congress, organized public awareness campaigns, and educated a new generation of Americans about this largely forgotten history. But their motivations for this activism went beyond the pursuit of personal justice. As Mishi Weglin, author of the seminal book Years of Infamy, explained, "We didn't do this for ourselves. We did it for our children and grandchildren, so they would never have to be ashamed of their heritage. And we did it for all Americans, so they could learn from our mistakes and never repeat this history." The phrase "blessing in disguise" should not be interpreted as minimizing the real suffering these families faced. Loss of property, separation from communities, psychological trauma, and years of uncertainty caused genuine and lasting damage. Many families never fully recovered from the financial and emotional blows of hospitalization, but what makes these mothers extraordinary is their refusal to allow suffering to be the sole narrative of their experiences. They insisted on finding meaning, purpose, and even gratitude within circumstances that could easily have justified only bitterness and despair. Helen Murau expressed this complex perspective. "I am not grateful for being sent to a concentration camp. No one should be grateful for injustice. But I'm grateful for the lessons I learned there, the friendships I formed there, and the strength I discovered in myself there. These things became gifts that I have carried with me for the rest of my life." This ability to hold seemingly contradictory perspectives, recognizing injustice while finding benefits, feeling sadness while choosing hope, experiencing trauma while building resilience, represents perhaps the most profound lesson these mothers have to offer us. They demonstrated that human beings have a remarkable capacity to transcend their circumstances through conscious choices about how to interpret and respond to their experiences. They showed that even when we cannot control what happens to us, we always retain some control over how we choose to let those experiences define us. The children who grew up under the influence of these extraordinary mothers have taken these lessons into diverse fields such as medicine, education, art, business, and public service. Many have become civil rights lawyers, dedicated teachers for disadvantaged students, doctors working in underserved communities, and artists who use their platforms to promote social justice. Dr. Robert Nakamura, who spent his childhood at Manzanar, later observed, "My mother taught me that we are not defined by the bad things that happen to us. We are defined by how we choose to respond to the bad things that happen to us." That lesson has shaped my entire career as a doctor and as a father. These mothers' legacy extends far beyond their own families. Their stories have become part of the American narrative about resilience, community, and the human capacity to find hope in the darkest circumstances. They have contributed to a more nuanced understanding of trauma and recovery, showing that survivors can be simultaneously wounded and strengthened by their experiences. Their perspectives also offered valuable insights into parenting in times of crisis. They demonstrated how to maintain emotional stability for children, even when adults are dealing with their own fears and uncertainties. They showed how to use adversity as a teaching opportunity, how to build resilience through consistent routines and clear expectations, and how to convey hope even when the future is uncertain. Psychologists who have studied Japanese-American families decades after internment have often noted exceptionally low levels of family dysfunction and exceptionally high levels of educational and professional achievement among the children of interns. Many attribute these outcomes to the parenting strategies developed by mothers during their years in the camp. Dr. Donna Nagata, a researcher specializing in the psychological impact of Japanese-American internment, noted, "Mothers in the camps intuitively developed many of the strategies we now recognize as fundamental to building resilience in children. They maintained consistent routines, communicated clear expectations, provided opportunities for community contribution, and modeled positive adaptation in the face of adversity." As these extraordinary mothers aged, many became dedicated oral historians, committed to ensuring their experiences would not be forgotten. They spoke at schools, participated in documentaries, and wrote memoirs not for personal glory, but out of historical responsibility. They understood that their stories were bigger than their individual experiences. They were lessons about the dangers of mass hysteria, the importance of protecting constitutional rights, even in times of crisis, and the power of human dignity to transcend dehumanizing circumstances. Mary Matsuda Grunewald, who wrote a detailed memoir about her experience at Minidoka, explained, "I didn't write this book so people would feel sorry for us. I wrote it so they could learn from our experience, so they could recognize the warning signs when fear begins to overcome judgment, so they could have the courage to stand up for justice even when it's unpopular." These mothers' lessons also resonate in contemporary contexts where families face displacement, discrimination, and uncertainty. Refugee communities, immigrant families, and other marginalized populations often find inspiration and practical guidance in the strategies developed by key Japanese-American mothers during their years of internment, their techniques for maintaining dignity in dehumanizing circumstances, for building community from scratch, for preserving cultural heritage while adapting to new realities, and for transmitting hope to the next generation remain relevant for families facing displacement and discrimination today. Social service organizations have also incorporated many of the strategies developed by mothers in the E camps into their programs for families in crisis, emphasizing maintaining routines, creating opportunities for contribution, preserving cultural connections, and focusing on long-term goals rather than immediate hardships have become standard approaches in trauma-informed care. When we consider the full scope of these extraordinary women's experiences, we begin to understand why some eventually characterized aspects of their hospitalization as a blessing in disguise. It wasn't masochism or denial. It was a profound recognition that human beings have a remarkable capacity to extract meaning, growth, and even gratitude from experiences that initially seem purely destructive. They discovered depths of strength they didn't know they possessed. They formed friendships that lasted a lifetime. They developed skills and perspectives that enriched their lives long after leaving camp. They discovered that happiness doesn't depend on external circumstances, but on internal choices about attitude and response. Most importantly, they learned that human dignity cannot be taken away, only surrendered. By refusing to surrender their dignity, even in the most challenging circumstances, they preserved not only themselves, but also a legacy of resilience that continues to inspire others today. Their stories remind us that adversity, though never desirable, can become a powerful teacher. That community can be built anywhere when people choose to support each other. That hope can survive even in the most hopeless environments when it is consciously nurtured and shared. And that love, for family, for community, for justice, for human potential, can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. As we conclude this journey through the experiences of these remarkable mothers, we're left with a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in the face of adversity. These women were not superhuman. They were ordinary mothers who faced extraordinary circumstances and chose to respond with courage, creativity, and compassion. Their stories challenge us to examine our own responses to difficulty. When faced with setbacks, disappointments, or injustices, do we choose bitterness or learning? Do we focus on what we've lost or what we still have? Do we see ourselves as victims or as agents of change? The Japanese-American mothers who found blessings in disguise in concentration camps show us that these choices are always available to us, no matter how dire our circumstances might appear. They remind us that human resilience is not just about surviving hardship, but about transforming hardship into wisdom, strength, and service to others. Their legacy lives on not only in their children and grandchildren, but in anyone who chooses to find light in darkness, to build community in isolation, to maintain hope in despair, and to see adversity as an opportunity to grow rather than simply a reason to give up. In honoring these extraordinary mothers, we also honor the resilient spirit that lives within all of us, the spirit that can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for learning, growth, and service to our shared humanity. These women found strength not only in themselves, but in a deep faith that even in their darkest moments, the Lord God had not abandoned them. They believed there was a greater purpose in their suffering, a divine lesson to be learned and shared with future generations. It was this unshakable faith that allowed them to transform concentration camps into communities of hope and personal tragedy into universal wisdom. Their stories teach us that when we face our own storms in life, we can choose to trust that the Lord God is present even in adversity, guiding us to discover strengths we didn't know we possessed and preparing us to serve others who will face similar challenges. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what time you watched this documentary. Your participation helps us continue sharing important stories like this.